Welcome to the Learning Curve with Castelle, with me, your host, Castelle. Today we're diving into a pressing issue. NPTE pass rates are dropping and the impact is real. So what's driving this decline? Is it changes in student learning habits, shift in PT education, or something deeper in how we prepare future therapists? To help us unpack this, we're joined by Will Crane, PT, DPT, OCS, founder of PT Final Exam, who has spent nearly a decade coaching PT students through this critical exam, and Jeremy VanDevender, founder of Equus Growth Advisors and former CRO of Ivy Rehab, who brings deep insight into education, strategy, and the evolving PT profession. So, are students truly prepared for today's NPTE, or is the system falling short? And most importantly, what can be done to reverse this trend? Stick with us as we break it all down, and stay ahead of the curve by visiting the link below. Thank you both for coming on today. We're so excited to have this discussion, and I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourselves. So, Will, let's start with you.
So I'm Will Crane. I'm a practicing physical therapist. I've got an orthopedic certification specialty, as well as the owner and founder of PT Final Exam. So we help students prepare for the National Physical Therapy Examination. I've been doing that for over a decade now. We've got all kinds of material, curriculum. We go on campuses. We do online material, kind of you name it. We do it to help students prepare for the exam. Plus, we work with universities to improve their pass rates, and have been extremely successful in helping not only the student improve, obviously, to pass the exam, but also the universities to improve their overall pass rates.
Awesome. Well, we're very excited to have you. Welcome. And Jeremy?
Jeremy VanDevender. I'm a physical therapist by background. I've been a PT now for 26 years. I most recently had the opportunity to lead all of the growth of a company called Ivy Rehab Physical Therapy, which I originally, amazingly, was able to be one of the first employees of back in 2003 when I opened the first clinic and was the first therapist hired by the company. And I got a chance to go back to Ivy in 2016 to help lead the development with some partners, and grew the business to one of the leading physical therapy practices in the country today with over 700 locations. I have just launched my professional consulting advisory business, Equus Growth Advisors, and I'm focused on providing strategic consulting, growth-oriented advisory services to entrepreneurs, private equity clients, venture capital, really around all aspects of consumer-facing healthcare. I think physical therapy has a lot of carryover to a number of other healthcare verticals that are solely focused on the patient experience and great outcomes. And the areas that I'm really passionate about, M&A, growth and development, professional education, outcomes, research, strategy, and helping entrepreneurs thrive in areas like digital healthcare and evolution to hybrid care within the musculoskeletal space. So this is something that's a very strong passion of mine for years around clinical education and elevating the PT profession. So really excited to work with Summit and help bridge the gap around exam prep as well as broader clinical education development for PTs across the country.
Awesome. Well, we are excited to have you here. So, Jeremy, let's start with you because it feels like you've done a lot. You've built many things. You've kind of been all over. So, what originally drew you to physical therapy in the first place?
Well, I decided to be a physical therapist when I was 16. So I guess that would be 32 years ago. I always loved medicine. I pretty much saw myself, growing up as a kid to be a doctor, particularly orthopedics. And I was an athlete growing up, and had some early exposure to physical therapy just around me being treated as a kid. And there's just something about the experience as a patient in physical therapy and the relationship with the therapist that was much more like, it's just a much deeper relationship than you get in the traditional medical setting. And I think I was drawn to that. And initially, I wanted to be an athletic trainer. That was my desired role. I wanted to work in sports medicine and be an athletic trainer when I was 16. And I remember going to a career fair at my high school in 1992, and I met an athletic trainer, and I was so excited to talk to him. And he's like, I went up to him, like, "What can I be?" He's like, "Don't be an athletic trainer, be a physical therapist." I was like, "Whoa, wait, why?" So we had a long discussion around the difference of physical therapy versus athletic training, and I just at that point started exploring it as a late high school student, and just fell in love with just the way that we engage with patients. I love the I call it the patient therapeutic alliance, that like connection you get seeing a patient 3 times a week for an extended period and getting to know them. And from that point on, I was pretty much hooked. I went to college with the full intent to be a physical therapist, and traditional undergrad transition to physical therapy school, and it all really worked out. And I graduated from PT school in 1999, and that rest was history. So I've just always loved it. I love the idea of being able to put your hands on a patient and connect with them and understand how to help them in a like non-invasive manner. I think I hate needles, so I think part of this was like I don't like. I think I was just always sort of turned away from like intrusive medicine. And I just found my sweet spot in managing patients that way, and have always loved the career.
That's really interesting that you point that out, because I know a lot of patients feel like the American medical field, especially, is more focused on medicine in particular than health. And I
Yeah.
think in physical therapy, there's kind of a unique opportunity to really truly be centered in wellness, which is exciting. So now, Will, I know you kind of came to it from a different way. So tell us a little bit about you. How did you get involved with physical therapy?
So I suppose it wasn't until I was late into my undergraduate. I was going through undergraduate program, all intents to be an engineer of some kind, mechanical, electrical. I really enjoyed math and physics, but it ended up that I just didn't love spending all day staring at a computer screen necessarily, rather than interacting with others. And so there was a pre-PT club at my university, and so decided to attend. And from there, it was kind of the rest was history. It just seemed to really fit between what I wanted to do with engaging with an interpersonal relationship with especially with physical therapy patients. It fit really well with kind of the physics and analytical mindset that there are things you can do to help people that are certainly in relation to the physics of muscles and joints and bones and all that. My brother was a physician, and he was really trying to convince me to go into the medical field, and I just didn't feel like it was a good fit. I went and shadowed a few physicians, and that just didn't feel like a really good fit for me. And so, anyway, physical therapy really, I settled in. It's been something that I've really enjoyed doing. I've practiced in a variety of fields. I practice right now in a rural area, so I get a little bit of everything, and that's a lot of fun too. To be able to have that acts that experience in working with lots of different individuals with lots of different issues. I get to work with them in their homes. I've worked on the sidelines at sporting events. I've worked in nursing homes, kind of all across that spectrum, working here in a rural area. So that's kind of my journey that took me here. I did get an orthopedic certification specialty a few years ago, and that's been a lot of fun to keep sharp, especially in a lot of the orthopedics. So that was my journey to get to where I am today, I suppose.
Now, it sounds like you're kind of working with anybody who has a body. Do you have a favorite group, like geriatrics, pediatrics, anybody in particular that is a favorite for you?
Hard to pick favorites, but I think some of my very best friends are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. So
Okay.
I've really enjoyed getting to know them. There's a lot of wisdom that they're just so happy to tell you all the things they've learned over the years, and I just have found that it's really fun and interesting to listen to some of their experiences.
Now, it sounds like you have a lot of listeners yourself. I think that that's one thing that old people love, is just someone who's eager to listen. But tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah, so I started the NPT podcast. I guess it's been about 5 years ago. So the NPT podcast is dedicated to helping students prepare for, pass, and have just an excellent experience as much as possible on the National Physical Therapy Examination, which is the board exam, or I think most listeners here will know that the NPTE is that final hurdle that you have to pass in order to become a licensed PT in the United States. And so for PTs and PTAs, that's really my primary focus, is helping them have an excellent experience and give them tools they need to succeed on exam day.
So now that's interesting because we've seen a steady decline in NPTE pass rates over the past 5 years. What do you think is driving this trend?
So it's probably multifactorial. I pulled up the pass rates just a moment ago. They did just barely publish the 2024 pass rates as of just a couple of weeks ago. But 5 years ago, so we have 5 years of published data, the first time pass rate was around 91%, which when you think about a standardized exam, okay, 91%, great. That means that obviously 91% of people are passing on their first attempt. That has dropped to 2023. It was down to 84%, and it looked like it just was going to continue dropping. And then we did see a slight bounce back in 2024. It came back up to 86%. But we're still like a significant margin lower. And to put that in real terms, like if you have, like I always point this out when I travel to schools and I've got a classroom, a cohort of 50 students, I say, 91% sounds great, or 85% sounds great, until you are part of the 6, 7, or 8 students of your cohort that don't pass. And it really hits home for them. They're like, oh my goodness, that could be me. And I think that is, as far as why, I really do feel like there's some COVID connection there, whether it be their undergraduate preparation was insufficient. Think about all the classes that were suddenly canceled, had to move online. All the curriculum totally was blown up and changed during the COVID era. And so I do feel like a lot of students are maybe missing a few pieces, especially from their baseline knowledge. And then that's transitioned. Obviously, there's some schools as well that had some more disruptions. So just disruptions in undergraduate, and disruptions in their DPT training. And then I don't know, there's probably a big discussion that could be had about the changing student needs and learning styles as well. But I the other point I guess I just wanted to make is that the NPT does go through a big update every 5 years, and 2024 was an update year. And so it's surprising that the pass rates bounce back up, because usually they go down on a big update year. But in any case, I do feel like it's multifactorial as to why the pass rates have come down rather precipitously. And then all of that, just to paint that in context, a university loses accreditation if they don't keep 85% or higher on their pass rates. And so if we're seeing a national average at 85, that means that there are probably a generous number of schools that are really, really sweating right now trying to keep that 85% pass rate.
Yeah, now that's interesting because how much of this decline do you think is attributed to changes in student preparedness versus changes in the exam itself?
A good question. Probably a little bit of both, but the exam really hasn't gone through, when I say big changes every 5 years, really the last big change was in 2016. So I, from the perspective of the curriculum development, the types of questions and styles, they did add what are called scenario-based questions last year, but they follow a very similar format. You're trying to just go through a patient chart and find the correct answer to 3 or 4 questions about that patient chart. It it is different, but it's not so substantively different that it like changes all your curriculum. It really just changes a little bit of how you read the question. Um, so, and then the question about student preparedness, there's a lot that could be said again about their undergraduate and graduate experiences. But I guess for whatever my theory is worth, my theory is that there are changes in the learning, in the student learning habits. Like I'll talk to many students these days that have not opened a textbook through their entire PT career, like their entire DPT schooling, which just boggles my mind. Like we had the pilot. I've got a whole pile of textbooks here. We've got, when I was in school, it was nothing but textbooks. And what's interesting is we've transitioned away from that. But the disadvantage is that the test questions continue to be written directly verbatim out of textbooks. And so I feel like that distancing from core textbook material has has been has been not very disadvantageous to the student, because it pulls them away from the source material for the exam.
So now this is a question I would put to the both of you, but with the rise of online learning in particular, what do you think students today are missing out on, especially when it comes to key aspects of hands-on training?
I guess I'll jump in. This has been an area for me that over the years has been really concerning around the way that therapists are learning and growing professionally. And I saw it in my most recent role as a leader at Ivy. That there's been a massive transition to digital individually driven learning. As I came up as a physical therapist, I knew no other way to become a better therapist than to go to in-person continuing education courses on a weekend, dedicate my time. Those were largely lab oriented, and we'd sit in lecture for half a day or a day. Generally, those were 2 to 3 day courses. So the intensity of the learning, it was very very focused. You would go to a class, fully intent, 21 hours of training over a weekend, and you were spending the entire day on Sunday, or half the day Saturday, the entire day Sunday, working on each other. And to me, I can't imagine a scenario as a physical therapist, which is a truly hands-on profession, where my skill set, both in physical therapy school, but obviously as a practicing therapist, isn't centered around that hands-on facilitation. It kind of baffles me. It certainly concerns me that so much of the learning is being done just through a medium that is just not highly engaged, and you just sort of hit a button. I would struggle tremendously as a therapist, as a professional, to learn in that environment. That's been a real concern. Another thing that's a concern to me around education is I think that, and this is kind of like an old man saying back when I was young, but call it what it is. I'm an old man saying when I was young. I was very involved when I started my career into the early transition of like steps of my career. Educational planning and development and my professional journey was really important to both myself and my employers. And we would be plotting out a professional journey for me that would allow me to grow as a provider, as a clinician, in a way that was adhered to the group I work for. I wanted to be better at treating shoulders or treating knees, and it was triggered to my clientele. And there was a plan that we were on together, and we would scope out educational opportunities together for me to grow in those skill sets. And then another thing that I found really important, and started when I was in PT school, and I'm sure Will probably had the same experience when I went to it, when I was on an internship in PT school. At the end of the internship, I had to give an in-service. And what did I learn? It's sort of like a book report almost. And anytime I went to a continuing education course as a new therapist and early in my career, I'd have to come back from that course and I'd have to present to my team, the clinic, what did I learn? That was the investment. I gave you $500 to go to this course, and you took a day off to do it. Well, come back and teach us. And I have not found that is centric to the experience of therapists who are going to education now, given the fact that it's just so limited in its touch. And that just gives me a lot of concern around how education is delivered today, and how employers and providers are linked up around a journey to become a great clinician. And I think it speaks to some of the turnover, the significant turnover we see in the profession around therapists leaving. I don't feel like they get the experience that they're on a journey to become great clinicians, and that's transformational to them, and that's quintessential to their employer. And I think it leads to turnover and people leaving the field out of dissatisfaction. So that's been my experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I concur there. That's been precisely my experience of it it still is strange to me that we rely, and it's good, it's very convenient to rely on online curriculum, but like Jeremy says, there's nothing that replaces being hands-on in person. And I do feel like schools do a really pretty decent job at that. They've got between the clinical internships that the students are required to complete as a part of their education, to many schools, I think almost categorically all the schools have hands-on practice during their labs. Their all the plinths that are in all the classrooms that I visit. Clearly, it's a part of what they do hands-on. but I think Jeremy's exactly right. Having that switch, that change in mindset from just doing this academic exercise just for the sake of doing it to rather doing it because it's part of a larger journey. So that I feel like that has always been and will continue to be a struggle for many students to make that switch from I'm not doing this just to like pass a class. I'm doing this actually to become a better clinician. And once they make that switch, you can almost see like the light comes on and they understand what they're all about rather than just doing things to jump through the hoops, so to speak.
Yeah.
Something to add to this that it just struck me is that, late in the 20s into like the early 2010s, most states, all states now mandated specific amount of educational hours to keep your license. And, it has become, that's a good thing. And there's no question that's a good thing that you mandate a certain level of educational commitment to stay licensed. And I applaud the evolution there. But the challenge that's come with that is you're forcing a number of hours on people, and when you do that, there's oftentimes people are going to find the lowest common denominator, the easiest entry point. And when it's mandated that you have to take X amount of hours in a 2-year period, and 20 months have gone by and you haven't taken them, then it's like a rush to the finish line. And that's where these online education tools have really come in, and they've thrived in that sense. But it really does deprive the therapist of that opportunity to learn and grow. And in a lot of ways, I put that back on the employers. It's really, as someone who's been, in, very large practices, and, it's really, really important that the employers of therapists, whether they be private practice, single site, or, large group with 1,000 sites, that they be deeply involved in their own passion for education and providing educational opportunities that are of the highest standard to their clinicians. And I think what those groups will find is if they make those investments, is they will see better engagement of their therapists. They will see better retention of their therapists. And I think it just goes back to a real commitment to education in our profession being at the highest level. And I think that's just some of the shift I've seen over the years. It's just not as critical. It's more of a rubber stamp, and get the hours in rather than become a great therapist who's going to contribute to this profession for years to come.
Now, I have to call you out. I would not particularly call you old. But I did want to touch on something that you'd mentioned earlier, just what you've seen. And Will, maybe you can add some insight to this as well. But how have student learning methods evolved over, let's say, the past decade?
So I guess I'll just jump in here. The students. So I've been training students for the exam for about 12 years now. So about a decade's worth of experience watching. Just anecdotally, when I first started, it was very common for our classes to be 3 hours long, 4 times a week. We'd have live. This was all done virtually, but a lot of questions, interaction, and lately in the last again I'm not saying this to cast any aspersions, just saying where the student's preferences lie. So previously we'd do about 12 hours of live instruction a week. Now I will have a 90-minute class scheduled, and I'll get questions during the class. Hey, when are we taking our 10-minute break? And it puzzles me a little bit because of that shift from, shoot, we used to do 3 hours, no problem. And now we can't do 90 minutes without a 10-minute break. I do think that the learner has now become accustomed, and again, for good and bad, I think that they've become accustomed to shorter, smaller, bite-sized bits of material. So think about it in terms of uh, like a 15-minute video is much more interesting and digestible than an hour and 15 minutes or 3 hours and 15 minutes. They like to put things into small little, almost like a little checkbox as you go through. And so that's been what we've tried to do with PT Final Exam, is try to create content that caters to the student preference. And so the student preference is for shorter form content with kind of a summary and key bits that we didn't used to have to do quite that way. In fact, when I first started a decade ago, I would offer assignments of reading textbooks, going through a workbook, a lot of really active style learning. And just again, for better or worse, that's transitioned now to short form content, easily digestible. And so we try to meet the student where they want to be and where they are the most engaged. And again, there's certainly been that change in learning style that's been interesting to me. Again, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad or good, just saying that it's been a pretty significant shift over the last decade.
I mean, I think we're all kind of experiencing that because we've all been on the consumer end of being just surrounded by screens and devices. And I know for me personally, when I went back to school, it was like, wow, because I grew up on textbooks as well. And then it was all of a sudden kind of like the phenomenon where I could commit to sitting down and watching 20, 15-minute long clips, but the idea of sitting down and watching like a 2 hour long thing just seemed mentally so daunting. So I think that a lot of us are kind of fighting to get our attention spans back, and I think that extends to students as well, except they have the added caveat of, maybe still have a developing brain. So it's definitely something that I think a lot of people are struggling with. And I think it's definitely impacting a lot of what we're seeing. So, Jeremy, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I'm a parent of a 16-year-old, so I've seen her go through school, and sophomore in high school, and I think there's a complete shift in the way education's delivered. I'm not an educational uh, expert in any way, shape, or form around the way that people learn, but it is very, very different to see, my daughter like doesn't have books, and I can't imagine a world where I learned without books. And I also found that I used to like write everything down. Like when I learned and I studied, I would take my lecture, I'd go back to my house, condo, whatever, and I'd rewrite everything I heard, and I'd do it again and again and again. That's how I learned. And what I've seen is that there's very little of that sort of transference of like memory. And I think it's a I mean, I'm sure there's experts out there who are million miles ahead of me with respect to understanding how the brain works and learning occurs. But I've seen this just from my own personal experience as a parent, watching a kid go through junior high and high school, and certainly through a pandemic and learning online. And my daughter is online school right now, so that's what she does, and I see it. I think it's a big gap with respect to memory and recounting what you learn, and being deeply engaged in like the process of and putting that into your head and remembering it. So I can't imagine that it doesn't play into some of the things that Will was speaking there around attention span and around ability to like stay in the game and like get on this. And then I'd imagine when you're taking a multi-hour test that is really, really challenging, to remember all the stuff that you went through in PT school that 90% of which you probably forgot along the way. That's really, really hard to do unless you are, really actively learning it. So I'm not surprised that we've seen a decline in the pass rates and some challenges on that front, just given the way that students are learning and recounting information and actively engaged in their own intellectual development and reconciliation.
Yeah. I think there also needs to be the added caveat that I know, especially kind of Gen Z and even my generation, millennials, get slammed with the short attention span thing. But I think that students now probably have a more taxed attention than any generation in history ever. I mean, all of these things that we have for our convenience, if you look at like the difference between sending a text message versus sending a letter, you get a letter, you don't sit down and write it out, your
Right.
response that day. You had some time, you could get around to it when you had a chance. And I think that a lot of the younger generation especially is just every second of every day is accounted for with some form of information, whether that's information as entertainment or information as education. So I think that that's probably also impacting quite a few people. And now, if we look at this from like the university side, what challenges are universities facing in maintaining high pass rates?
I mean, it's always the same thing. To maintain a high pass rate means that the information has to be disseminated from the instructor and from the university side into the student or to the student, or in some way digestible so that they can have it locked in. And so the challenge that the universities face is very similar to what I described, that the learner has changed over the last 20 years, but the test really is not substantively different. It's still all of what you learn in PT school from core PT texts as the primary reference. So the challenge they're facing is how do we meet the students where they need us to be to help them learn. And it's I have seen many universities that we've talked about how they really struggle. They struggle to keep the students' attention. They struggle now with how do we get them to actually learn the material and not just pull up AI or do a little, I don't know, a little Google search or plagiarism or whatever. I mean, you name it. Uh, there's a lot of obviously there's a high stakes to graduating PT school and taking the exam. And so the students are in some ways incentivized to find workarounds without actually learning the material. And so that is the ever present struggle. Like I just had a university I talked to where they had a student who this wasn't the board exam. This was the practice examination that they had at the end of their curriculum, that the student took the practice exam and the instructor had access to see the results of the exam, but the student didn't do as well as they wanted. So they created, kind of AI generated, a report that they turned into their professor that was not the actual report. The professor pulled up the actual report and saw the student submitted report and said, hey, wait a sec, these are not the same thing. And so there's a lot of pressure from the student to perform well, but a lot of tools they can use to, we'll say, skirt the system, get around somehow, circumvent any of the we'll call them not obstacles, but the standards in place to make sure that they are actually performing well. So I don't know. There's a lot of struggles that they have, and not the least of which is just trying to keep that academic rigor with the changing student learning methods.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of us here probably grew up with our math teachers telling us, well, you need to learn this because you're not going to have a calculator everywhere you go. And surprise, surprise, we all have a calculator. I mean, basically, attached to our arms at this point. So I think it's interesting too, because the exact tools that we are telling students it's unethical to use are going to be available after they graduate as well. So it's definitely a balancing act. But are there any particular schools or programs that are bucking this trend or are doing something differently that come to mind?
So I talked to a lot of schools across the U.S. There are some that are maintaining a high, like right at 100% or 99% first-time pass rates. And I really think it boils back down to, from day one, I had one professor she was talking to me this last quarter and saying, hey, people are kind of telling us that, oh, you're just training the test. You're not training them for actual practice. You're just training the test. And, it didn't set well with her. It's like, well, yeah, I guess we are kind of just training the test. And I pointed out that the test represents entry-level practice, that it is your baseline level of knowledge to keep the patient safe, to be direct and effective in your interventions. So indeed, we are training the test because the test is meant to represent the entry-level practice, the baseline that a student must have. And so it kind of opened her eyes for a moment. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, we absolutely should be training the test from day one. And so the programs that are the most successful are the ones that like I've seen so many different examples of not doing it right, where they'll do like lots of free response questions, or they'll do a verbal or oral exam rather than a standardized multiple choice type question exam. And so the students will have their first real high stakes experience on exam day, and it turns into kind of a disaster for them. So preparing early with the style of the question, as well as just creating that expectation, that academic rigor that you will be required to do this at the end of all this, it's critical that they start early.
Yeah. Now, I think the training the test is so insightful because, like you said, I mean, the test is representative of something much larger. But I think it also begs the question, and Jeremy, and I invite you to add your thoughts on this as well. Does the NPTE need to evolve? Is it time? Or is it really the students in schools that have the responsibility to catch up?
I like what Will said, that that the test is meant to um, basically uh, test your ability at entry level practice. So if the test itself is directed entry level practice, I it's hard for me to say the test should change. That I think we need to ensure students are very much preparing for the test through the course of their education, and really embracing the fact that failure in some senses is not an option. And I found that maybe there's a different intensity, and it's probably a generational thing as well. Where when I came out of physical therapy school 26 years ago, there was a real, there's a massive pride in coming out and practicing and getting your hands on patients as quickly as possible and being a part of an amazing profession. And I think when you've got a profession where you've got a lot of people who, and at least this is my anecdotal point of view, and there's no data to back it up other than conversations I've had and just experience, that I feel like a lot of new graduates are sort of putting their toe in the water. Do I really want to do this? Is this the thing that I want my career to be? And that's why, I mean, I'm astounded by the number of therapists who leave the profession or morph out of the clinical services and they go into a non-clinical role very, very quickly in their career, 1, 2, 3 years out. And I think that's a concern that schools need to look at around who they're admitting. And we might be in a situation where there just are too many PT schools and too many students going through. And in some sense, you've watered down the people who are just absolutely committed to being a part of this profession and carrying it forward as the next generation. And that's given me a lot of concern. I never intended to leave practice. I left practice because it was a natural evolution of my career after 12, 15 years to maximize my scope. But it was not something that we thought about 25 years ago, that I'm going to do this and I'm not going to be a practicing PT after 3, 4, 5 years. So I think there needs to be some more rigor at the program level around who they're admitting, why they're admitting them, and ensuring that we have therapists who really want to carry this torch for a generation to make sure physical therapy thrives and grows, rather than changing the exam to meet where students are today. Maybe we want to evolve the type of people coming into the profession that are going to meet the needs of the profession for the next 25 years.
I love that. And I think something too that also deserves mentioning is that for this generation that's going through this right now, a lot of them, because they are so accustomed to online schooling, are also missing out on so many intangible parts, like just interacting with people. And so you have also then like that social anxiety that plays a role. And so now, like, what is advice that you would give to a student preparing for the NPTE today that might be different from what you'd say 10 years ago?
Will, you want to grab that?
Yeah, I that's a really good question, because 10 years ago I would be saying essentially the same thing, that the you need to prepare for exams. The number one evidence-based way to prepare for a standardized exam, this bears out across multiple studies. The number one evidence-based way to improve your performance on a standardized exam is to take practice questions like the standardized exam will be. And so I know that's kind of a no-brainer, but you say to yourself, all right, well, you need to take lots and lots of low stakes quizzes that are formulated in the same way as the NPTE. So that advice remains unchanged. I guess the part that would change is just I used to be maybe much more of a purist about, you've got to take practice questions, you got to make flashcards, you got to write it all out, just like Jeremy said, write it all out, get everything on paper. And I think I've just, I don't know if I've evolved or just the students' needs have evolved a little bit, that it now is more of, okay, do what works to get it to stick in your brain, whether that be like a Quizlet, you've got some type of OneNote app or some note-taking app. AI can be helpful at, if you plug in all of your notes, then it can create these little, they're not really good multiple choice questions yet. AI is certainly growing in that regard, but you can take all of your typewritten notes, plug it into AI, and it'll spit out little quizzes for you. It's a great tool that obviously didn't even exist a couple of years ago, much less 10 years ago. And so using those tools to your advantage would be extremely advantageous if you're willing to do the input time And that hasn't changed. You have to get that content into your mind, onto the, whether it be the pad of paper or into the note-taking app or whatever. You've got to do the first step to actually understand it, because the second step of review, that really is the only thing that has changed. The tools for review are the real big difference here. Anyway, so as far as the change goes, you've got to still stick with core material and practice exams, but now you've got more tools to help you to do the review, the read, recite, review type, just review to get it to stick in your brain.
I think that's fantastic advice. And Jeremy, what about you?
No, I think it's about intent. To me, it's a moment where you put all this work in, 3 years of school, PT school, 4 years of undergrad, all the money that you've spent. There's an intentionality to it, and I think you've got to go into this from the standpoint of, mentally, I'm not going to fail. I'm absolutely going to, like, this is my moment to put school behind me and go into my profession. And there's just pride, and there's just like. So I really point to this as from a psychological standpoint of, like you would for a competition or sport. You go out there to win, leave it all on the field, and do all the work that you have to do well in advance to ensure that, you're able to go out and, practice your craft and be successful in this next horizon of your development as a practicing therapist. And, for me, if I was, coming out of PT school today, I would be thinking about this months and months and months in advance and challenging myself and my peers to make sure that, I, without question, passed. And I just think it's an intentionality to it. It's not it's not a pedestrian experience. You just want to, like, I can take it 5 more times. I wouldn't want any. I couldn't imagine having that continued pressure and stress and sort of like, I can take it again. But it's about intentionality, and I think that does come back to that pride of coming out and treating patients and being a professional leader that you can hold your head high, your shoulders high, and say, I'm doing what I love to do. And, this is just a step along the way that I've got to get over, and then, do what I'm passionate about.
I love that. I think the intersection of both of your answers is the absolutely ideal package for people to take away. So thank you so much for joining us here. This was our first roundtable discussion on the learning curve. So we're glad that you were a part of it. And if people want to hear more from you or connect with you, where can they find you?
So for me, I just launched my consulting company yesterday, Equus Growth Advisors, EQUUS, the Latin root for horse. We were talking about earlier on. So I've got a website, www.equus-advisors.com, and I can be contacted on there or on LinkedIn. In my profile, I'm really active on LinkedIn, and would love to hear from anybody. And so for me, I'm pretty easy to find, either through LinkedIn or through my company connection that's just started.
And Will?
The easiest way, so we have a free podcast called the NPTE podcast. That's great for students. So any of you who work with students, send them that direction. So we do a practice question in every episode. And then alternatively, you can find me and contact me at ptfinalexam.com. That's the best way to get in contact.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure.
And that wraps up this episode of The Learning Curve with Castelle. We've explored the shifting landscape of NPTE pass rates, the challenges students and educators face, and the critical steps needed to ensure future PTs are truly prepared. A huge thank you to Will Crane and Jeremy VanDevender. I had a lot of fun, and I appreciate them sharing their expertise and insight. If today's conversation got you thinking, let's keep it going. What changes do you think could make the biggest impact? Leave a comment below, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you found this discussion valuable, leave us a review. It helps more listeners like you stay ahead of the curve. And don't forget, you could explore more resources at the link below. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the forces shaping the world of PTs, OTs, and SLPs. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and stay ahead of the curve.